Imagine, if you will, for a minute that the Axis powers were instead the victors of World War II, but not in the way that alternative history folks often picture it by dissecting a German world, but one in which the crux of US involvement, the Japanese Empire, is the relevant topic. Many groups of people within the imperial periphery of Japan's control saw decades of rampant repression, including Chinese, Koreans, Russians, and other minority groups from Siberia, the Republic of China, etc. Meanwhile, we look at a post-war United States where they don't emerge as a superpower as actual history has shown, but instead fall into collapse and disrepair while poverty shakes the states. New borders are drawn by the new Japanese overlords, constant fighting now takes place between Americans of former territories, and the general state of the once powerful United States is no longer in position to defend itself. Suddenly, in this new and expanded Japanese empire, a group of minorities who have been facing repression band together with a new ideology, planting themselves in one specific part of the now weakened United States and claim it as their homeland, for one reason or another, and begin moving en masse to, say, California. This region now gets a new name, and the Japanese Empire realizes a massive benefit in controlling an outpost across the Pacific Ocean. This movement is backed by one of the most advanced militaries on the planet, and over a few more decades, the majority of those who once inhabited the area are either forced out, imprisoned in horrible conditions, or are straight up executed by this new movement of people repressed from another land. In a weird kind of way, Americans are now facing what many natives faced centuries ago. You might say to yourself, this seems rather silly. The solution is not to move the repressed minority from one land to another and make them the new oppressors. The solution is simply to make life for the minority safer in the land they grew up in. And you would be correct. Now, the good part about all of this is this narrative stops there, because dealing in speculation is not how you analyze history. And I'm sure some cheeky commenter will be very fast to point out how nobody in East Asia would claim historical significance in North America. However, I regret to inform you that this type of colonial project isn't too different from some very real existing ones, one that we're going to talk about in particular, in real life. Picture the phenomena of a region that historically, over hundreds or perhaps thousands of years, grew to be dominated by specific people groups of the same origin, but then suddenly one tiny slice of it grows to be dominated by a different group in the time of mere decades. If you haven't figured it out by now, the ideology that I'm talking about is Zionism, and the country in question here is Israel. Now, interestingly enough, this would not actually be the first project of its type. The African country of Liberia is more or less a concept in a similar vein, in its creation being for free black Americans and formerly enslaved people dating back to 1822. Sounds neat on paper, but the ACS, or American Colonization Society, was founded by a group of white Americans in order to deal with the problem of the growing number of black Americans by resettling them in Africa. Suddenly that doesn't sound so glamorous, does it? Similarly, those familiar with Garveyism, a black nationalist movement founded by Marcus Garvey after the World War I era, will see the dangers in something similar, as Garvey even approved of the KKK movement simply because of its desire to separate the white and black populations in the United States. But in order to stay focused, we're going to deal strictly in what the title of this video suggests, and that is the problem with Israel. The problem with Israel is that it's a colonial project, existing as an imperial outpost with nearly a century of war in the name of that colony, all masked as a historical claim to a so-called homeland, backed by the historical mistreatments of Jews in Europe. To make myself clear, that latter point is undeniable, as the Jewish population of Europe faced more hardship on the continent than just about any other people group, especially after the Nazi Party took control in Germany. But the solution to facing repression at home is not to create repression elsewhere, and to make myself even more clear, being anti-Zionism isn't being anti-Semitic. In fact, I'd argue that Zionism itself is rather anti-Semitic, which we'll get into in a bit. For this video, I'm going to pull from three main sources, namely The 100 Years' War in Palestine by Rashid Khalidi, Israel, a Beachhead in the Middle East by Stephen Gowans, and a few parts from David McCullough's Truman, as McCullough touches on some US policy around the time when Israel was created as a country. I will also pull from other statistics and articles as needed. Looking back at my fake introductory situation, you'd find a rather stark comparison to something Harry S. Truman said around the time of Israel's creation. According to McCullough, Truman says, "What I am trying to do is make the whole world safe for Jews. Therefore, I don't feel like going to war in Palestine. The action of some of our US Zionists will prejudice everyone against what they are trying to get done. I fear very much that the Jews are like all underdogs. When they get on top, they are going to be just as intolerant and cruel as the people were to them when they were underneath. I regret this decision very much because my sympathy has always been on their side." Quoted from McCullough. It's unfortunate that Mr. Truman did not take a little more time to think this issue through, but more on that in a bit. Looking at Khalidi's work, what he calls the 100 Years' War can essentially be broken down into 6 different declarations of war, all of which further things towards the point that we've reached today in the 2020s. You see, many folks like to pretend that these events have only been unfolding since October 7th, 2023. In fact, if you Google search, when did the Israel-Hamas conflict start, this is the exact date that will come up, as I'll show you on screen. Change Hamas to Palestine and the date moves back to 1948. However, even this falls short of the truth. Perhaps you've heard others discard this entirely and take another popular talking point route, such as, the Jews and the Arabs have been fighting for thousands of years. Nothing is ever going to change that. As a cheeky attempt to make the conflict feel no different than any other war that shook the region throughout history. Oftentimes, these people are coming from a biblical perspective, conflating European Jews with ancient Israelites that fled from Egypt. What's even more ironic is, if you take that overly simplified way of thinking, you're actually ignoring the Canaanites, the Hittites, and other people groups who existed there even before the biblical times. If you don't believe me, see Exodus 3:17, 13:5, 23:23, 23:28, 33:2, and 34:11. So the odds are that those people who use this argument are ignoring their own source anyway, which will likely boil down to something like God's chosen people in order to shut down the conversation before it even begins. Unlike those who like to make the claim that either this conflict just started in 2023 or that it's been going on since the beginning of time, we're going to deal strictly in actual history, through a dialectic lens that focuses on the contradictions in the situation. To do this, we'll examine Zionism itself, the 6 declarations of war, and the details around all of these, as well as US, British, or Western policy towards Palestine. And finally, why Zionism prevails today. Part 1. Zionism and Anti-Semitism. To start, it's worth noting that a lot of Zionists have not even been Jews, or at least didn't practice Judaism, or even abandoned it at some point. Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, was actually an atheist, as was his lieutenant Max Nordau. Other early Zionists were actually Christians, a community that still seems to be under its grip, such as William Blackstone, who presented something known as the Blackstone Memorial to U.S. President Benjamin Harrison in 1891. According to Gowans, he thought that the Jewish facilitation to Palestine was, quote, a precondition for the return of the Christian Messiah, end quote. It is often said that early Zionists justified their missions with a statement around Palestine being a, quote, land without people for a people without land, end quote. But looking into their writings tells a different story. Quoting Gowans again, in Old Land New, by Herzl, his alter ego Friedrich Lowenberg travels to Jaffa and Jerusalem and clearly sees the land teeming with poor, quote, Turks, dirty Arabs, and timid Jews, end quote. Herzl contrasts the Arab Palestine of poverty, filth, decay, and neglect with the Palestine of Jewish settlement. He did not view the colonization of Palestine as a project to fill an empty land, but as a program of conferring the benefit of Western civilization on what he saw as backwards and inferior people of the Middle East. Thus, Herzl himself viewed it as a colonial project, comparing it to, quote, Puritans persecuted for their beliefs who had colonized North America, end quote. Much of Herzl's thinking comes from 2 main books, which we just sampled, and The Jewish State, taking a pessimistic stance that mankind is evil by nature, not by circumstance. As a matter of fact, he even foresaw the disaster of such a project himself. Looking at Gowans again, he states, quote, the plan, Herzl argued, was bound to end in disaster. There would come the inevitable moment that the native population would feel itself threatened and force the government to stop further influx of Jews, end quote. This seems to go hand in hand with what we quoted from Mr. Truman earlier, so it should be easy to surmise at this point that Palestinians never hated Zionism because they hated Jews, but because they hated usurpers. Looking back at Marcus Garvey, the same would have occurred with his project. In fact, Garvey championed the view of Old Land New with the conclusion that white Americans would never accept black Americans as equals, and that the solution to the persecution of blacks lay in separation and return to Africa. Now, can you imagine telling your black community that the only solution to their persecution was to move back to Africa? Let me know how that turns out. It really wouldn't be any different than telling a Jew to move to Palestine as the only solution to facing anti-Semitism in the West. This is precisely why I see Zionism as anti-Semitic itself, in that Garveyism is racist in and of itself. Finally, it's worth noting that Palestine was not even the only land thought of for settlement of a Jewish state. According to the archaeologist, at least 6 other locations are given as possibility, including Madagascar, Tasmania in Australia, Suriname, Ararat City in the USA, Uganda, and even a Soviet autonomous oblast in the Far East called Birobidzhan, which never picked up traction. I can't imagine why. If this alone doesn't sever any justification to a so-called homeland, then perhaps the reaction when U.S. Press Secretary Charlie Ross announced recognition of Israel as a state will. According to McCullough, the entire U.S. delegation was, quote, flabbergasted, with some American delegates even breaking out into laughter, thinking that it was someone's idea of a joke. Now remember, before 1948 there was never a country known as Israel, and apparently the idea of naming a colonial project for Jewish immigration Israel, even at the time, was that cartoonishly funny, but we'll return to this in a little while. Before we move on to the actual history of what happened and not just the doctrine of Zionism, it's important to understand that none of this could have been possible without the backing of some great power or another. As Herzl states in The Jewish State, the land needed to be, quote, a political world question to be controlled by the civilized nations in the World Council, end quote. Conveniently, at the time, the great powers of the world had already divided up much of it amongst themselves, and also, according to Herzl, needed, quote, the friendly intervention of interested governments to drive considerable benefits from it, end quote. After all, empires that are hostile to the Jewish people aren't going to just do this without something in return. Part 2. The Balfour Declaration and British Protection. We're going to start diving into the history by turning back to Rashid Khalidi for a bit to discuss what he calls the first declaration of war, taking place in 1917 in the form of the Balfour Declaration. Just before the end of the First World War, this would be what introduces the threat to Palestine, pledging support for Theodor Herzl's plan of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So who was this Balfour person? It refers to Arthur James Balfour, or Lord Balfour, a British statesman that served as Prime Minister of the UK from 1902 to 1905, and the Foreign Secretary to David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister of the UK during this declaration. According to Khalidi, Balfour had former ties to colonial projects, including Ireland, which earned him the nickname Bloody Balfour. But let's take a look at the land of Palestine in 1917. At the time, about 6% of the population was Jewish, all of which lived somewhat similar to the Palestinians culturally, as did the Christians. Most of them were not Zionists, and many spoke Arabic or Turkic. This kind of flips the whole Jews and Arabs have been fighting since the beginning of time argument on its head, but I digress. None of the majority Arab population was mentioned in the Balfour Declaration, other than as, quote, non-Jews. It's framed this way to make it sound as if there wasn't already a majority Arab population in the land that had been historically Arab for thousands of years, surrounded by several other Arab states. Political and national rights were only declared for the Jewish population, again, only 6% at the time, and to make matters worse, British censorship and the lack of news distribution prevented the threat from reaching the masses as early on. After the conclusion of the First World War, Herzl's successor Chaim Weizmann would meet with David Lloyd George to set up occupation of the former Ottoman regime, in the form of the Mandate for Palestine, or Mandatory Palestine, in 1922. All of the other territories under former Ottoman control would, quote, win, and I use that word rather liberally, independence in the form of British or French protectorate status, but not Palestine. I'm talking about Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and the other surrounding states. Now imagine this scenario. It's 1922, coming out of a world war, and you move from the dynastic empire of the Ottomans to the control of the British, with your homeland being promised to someone else. With this massive influx of Jews comes a massive influx of capital and troops backed by the British Empire to see it happen. This is one of the most fundamental issues of simply treating the Israeli-Palestine issue as one side versus the other, framing it as two foes on equal footing, and giving the one with the far stronger backing the only historical tie to the land that wouldn't be called Israel for another 26 years. By 1926, the Jewish population in Palestine had tripled from 6 to 18%, which would stagnate until the Nazis took power in Germany in 1933. What's interesting is that during this time, many Jews in Germany were not allowed to go to the UK or the USA due to the same discriminatory laws that led to Zionism in the first place. Further, there was even something known as the Transfer Agreement between Nazi Germany and the Zionist movement, which was concluded in exchange for lifting a Jewish boycott in Germany. According to Khalidi, many of the refugees fleeing anti-Semitic persecution were, quote, skilled and educated. German Jews were allowed to bring assets worth a total of $100 million thanks to the Transfer Agreement, end quote. He continues, quote, during the 1930s, the Jewish economy in Palestine took over the Arab sector for the first time, and the Jewish population grew to more than 30% of the total by 1939, end quote. Before concluding this first declaration of war, let's look back at Gowans quickly, as he summarizes anti-Semitism in Europe at this time pretty decently. Gowans states that it's important to note that it's been around for ages, but it became a political tool for the far right as a conservative reaction against the French Revolution. This would have intensified the conditions that led to the creation of Zionism, which was amped up even more following the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Bolshevik Revolution around the same time as the first declaration of war. Thus, it's no wonder Jews might have historically gravitated towards left-wing movements, as even at the time, moderate left folks probably weren't too fond of Jews either. This is actually where that theory of Judeo-Bolshevism came out of, a scare tactic that led to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, believed even by one Winston Churchill. Thus, it was very easy to tie Jewish movements to communist ones and paint them all as a problem that needed to be dealt with. Kinda like what certain individuals do with the term cultural Marxism today. Anyway, this contradiction is what would lead to the 1936 to 1939 revolt in Palestine. By then, 17% of the land of Palestine was occupied by European Jews, leading to the expulsion of 200,000 Palestinians since 1917. The British Empire had provided arms for the suppression of this revolt, and the outcome was the Peel Commission to make the non-Jewish part of the state part of Transjordan, which was not favored by most Palestinians, leading to the conference in 1935 under Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister between 1937 and 1940. He issued a white paper to appease the outrage over British involvement in the Zionist project, but it was too late, as Winston Churchill soon took over, a loud supporter of Zionism. To close off this part, we'll again quote Khalidi on the situation as it was in 1939. Quote, "The Palestinians found themselves in a triple bind. Unlike other peoples who fell under colonial rule, they not only had to contend with the colonial power in the metropole, in this case London, but also the singular colonial settler movement that, while beholden to Britain, was independent of it, had its own national mission, a seductive biblical justification, and an established international base and financing." End quote. This becomes important in understanding how unique the situation is here compared to other settler colonies in the United States or Australia, and imperial colonies like most of Africa at the time. In a sense, Palestinians were dealing with both. Part 3. The USA, Nakba, Division, and the Suez Crisis. What Rashid Khalidi calls the Second Declaration of War on Palestine came in the form of the Nakba in 1947 and 1948, which translates in Arabic to catastrophe. This was preceded by what was then known as the Jewish Brigade of the British Army, which formed in 1944 as the Second World War was coming closer to an end. The British supplied training and combat experience to the Zionist military forces, but it goes back even further than that. In 1942, there was this little-known thing called the Biltmore Program, which was the first time the Zionist movement called for the conversion of all of Palestine into a Jewish state, marking the start of an escalation you can see in these maps here. After 2 decades of hardship with militarily backed immigration, a country that's still 2/3 Arab majority is now being coined a national home by this movement. This would also mark the mobilization of American politicians, which played a large part in the US hegemony in the Middle East. For a while, of course, another country, the USSR, also emerged victorious from the Second World War, granting them status as a superpower to challenge this, but we all know how that turned out later on. One of Britain's own historians, Albert Hourani, even openly knew what this meant for the Palestinian case and what the Zionist program meant for it. He states to the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry in 1946 that, quote, "In the past few years, responsible Zionists have talked seriously about the evacuation of the Arab population, or part of it, to other parts of the Arab world," end quote. It would, quote, "involve a terrible injustice that could only be carried out at the expense of dreadful repressions and disorders, with the risk of bringing down in ruins the whole political structure of the Middle East," end quote. Let's look into this a little further. New Arab states weren't innocent bystanders in all this, and in many ways they were compliant. In fact, King Abdullah of Transjordan had ambitions to dominate most of Palestine himself. He had, quote, "extensive contact with the British and Jewish agency leaders and hoped to incorporate Arab-majority regions while secretly meeting with the UN," according to Khalidi. Further, King Faisal of Iraq and Ibn Saud relied entirely on British officials with loyalty to British interests. This disunity is an important point because most of the Arab leaders were in fact chosen by European overlords. Looking to Khalidi again, some Arab leaders were even obliged via treaty to have such advisors. Quote, "The British ambassador's residence in Amman abutted the royal palace, providing for a short trip through the back garden to offer guidance to the king. At times, such advice was quite muscular. In 1942, Ambassador Sir Miles Lampson, unhappy with the Egyptian government of the day, ordered British tanks to surround Abdeen Palace in Cairo, entered the palace grounds in his Rolls-Royce, and the palace doors were shot open, and commanded King Farouk to appoint Britain's choice of Prime Minister." End quote. It's no coincidence that Prime Minister Mustafa Nas Pasha was the one who refused to allow Palestinian representation at the Arab League. Interestingly, the US had already had a hand in this region dating back to 1933, as Aziz of Saudi Arabia had made an agreement with US oil companies that still describes the allyship the US sees today with the Saudi king. Furthermore, President Franklin D. Roosevelt pledged no harm to the Arabs of Palestine, which was later discarded by Truman's administration. So with that, let's return to McCullough to review the inner workings of Harry Truman's administration at the time. According to McCullough, American policy, quote, "generally speaking, favored immediate independence for Palestine, which would be divided or partitioned into 2 separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, joined in an economic union. The US also supported the idea of large-scale Jewish immigration to the new homeland," end quote. From the British perspective, Truman seemed carelessly pro-Zionist, though we should note that Churchill at the peak of his power had also championed a homeland, claiming that I am a Zionist. In 1946, Truman had called for his administration for the admission of 100,000 Jews to Palestine, which Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin described as a, quote, crude desire for votes in New York, end quote, and suggested he had no wish to see more Jews come into the United States. Now, some of this was speculation from inter-Washington infighting, but what we can't ignore is that throughout World War II, Western governments were not very quick to take Jews in as refugees during Hitler's reign, preferring to send them all to this still unnamed homeland, further highlighting why Zionism itself is anti-Semitic. By this point, the Arab Palestinians declared that partition of their country meant war, thus Truman warned his chiefs of staff that no less than 100,000 troops would be needed to protect the Jewish migrants, especially considering Britain was about to withdraw 50,000 of theirs. Unfortunately for Truman, Jewish pressure did not cease after this, and out of frustration, he refused to speak on the subject, nor would he see Chaim Weizmann publicly. Still, in private, a map lay spread out on his desk and borders were drawn, a fate that matched the rest of the Middle East. Even General George Marshall expressed concern over this, stating that the U.S. was, quote, playing with fire it had no way of putting out, end quote. Thus, it was later recommended to abandon the plan, calling for temporary UN trusteeship, which was met with severe backlash from the Jewish community. The full New York Times quote describes the predicament as, quote, a land of milk and honey now flows with oil, and the homeland of three great religions is having its fate decided by expediency without a sign of spiritual and ethical considerations, which should be determining at least that part of the world. Ancient Palestine was once described as not the land of philosophers, but the home of the prophets. It would take a prophet sitting on a rapidly spinning turntable to have foreseen the outcomes of which our government has pursued during the last few months, end quote. Pressure still came from Weizmann, as he wrote to Truman, quote, the choice for our people, Mr. President, is between statehood and extermination, end quote. Something to consider at this point was the administration's drive to recognize the new state before the USSR did. Clark Clifford of the White House Council was to prepare a case for the immediate recognition of the new Jewish state before it even had a name. Recall the beginning of the video, the reactions of everyone once it was revealed to be Israel. As you can see, all this was a gigantic political game in Washington. Clark Clifford and David K. Niles were perhaps the loudest champions for this cause, stating that it was, quote, crucial for the Jewish vote, end quote, but also that Truman as president should not, quote, damage the strategic importance of oil reserves, end quote. McCullough states, quote, like most Americans, he knew relatively little about Arabs and their culture, but at the same time he had no wish to damage relation with the Arabs, whose hostility to the establishment of a Jewish state in their midst appeared implacable. American relations with the Arab states had been good until now, and the chiefs of staff fearing an oil-starved war put great stress on the importance of maintaining those relations. To the Arabs, it seemed they were being made to pay for the crimes of Hitler, end quote. The final thing we'll look at from McCullough is the role of Eddie Jacobson, a close friend of Truman's. He himself claims he wasn't a Zionist, but a Jew who often looked to the Zionist leaders for guidance on the question of refugees. Thus, he advised Truman a lot, along with all of the other pressure from Jewish groups in the United States. Yet, Truman had zero Arab constituents. With all this, it became very clear to see why he was moved so easily to recognize Israel, which led to the Nakba. Then arises the question of the USSR, the other power that emerged victorious. Shortly after U.S. recognition, Stalin would give, quote, de jure recognition, end quote, according to McCullough. However, Khalidi actually gives a little bit more of insight from this. Stalin allegedly saw Israel as a counterweight to all British pawn monarchies that we discussed earlier, assuming it would align with the USSR. Boy, was he ever wrong. In fact, tensions brewed very quickly after Israel was recognized as a state. And by 1955, Israeli-Soviet relations cooled entirely. It was around this time that the Pentagon began to see Israel as a huge ally, though they wouldn't lend massive military and economic support that we know of today till about 1970. So let's take a look at the UN and its Resolution 181 of the General Assembly in 1947. This is what called for the partition of dividing Palestine into a large Jewish state and a smaller Arab one. This era of US taking over actually saw a lot of backlash towards the British from the Yishuv, which was a Jewish settlement before Israel became a state. According to Khalidi, they would carry out assassinations of British officials and blow up a British headquarters due to them preferring control through the Arab monarchies over the now US-led Zionist project. The events of the Nakba ran from November of 1947, following Resolution 181, until full British withdrawal and Israeli statehood in May of 1948. This would result in an ethnic cleansing that resulted in the departure of 300,000 Palestinians and completely devastate the entire political, economic, and cultural centers. Plan Dalet in 1948 specifically was a depopulation of Jaffa and Haifa, which were two of the largest urban Arab settings, as well as scores of other Arab towns, including Tiberias. Further, Khalidi writes, quote, "For the majority, this meant destitution, the loss of homes, jobs, and deeply rooted communities. Villagers lost their land and livelihoods, and urbanites their properties and capital, while the Nakba shattered the power of the country's notables under their economic base." End quote. He continues, quote, "The Nakba formed an enduring touchstone of identity, one that has lasted through several generations. The Nakba provided the new focus of the collective identity. It broke up families and communities, dispersing Palestinians among multiple countries and different sovereignties." End quote. After this, only about 160,000 Palestinians remained in the new state, one crafted strictly for that of the Jewish majority, and many lived under strict martial law, with much of their land being seized through 1966. The Nakba would play perhaps the largest role in transforming Palestine from a land of thousands of years of Arab majority to a Jewish majority through rapid theft of land and property. Looking back to the Arab states, many of them were reluctant to recognize Palestine not only because of the control many had from Britain, but also their military weakness in comparison to Israel. When Gamal Abdel Nasser came into power as an independent Egyptian regime, he tried to avoid provoking Israel until he was undermined by aggression from their Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Before 1956, Israel carried out large-scale operations against Egypt in the Gaza Strip, which brought Egypt to an arms deal with Czechoslovakia. Further, because of tight control of the Gaza Strip, lethal attacks were carried out on Israel, and a disproportionate counterattack killed 69 Palestinians in Kibya. All this brings us to the Suez War launched by Israel in 1956. You see, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company and supported Algerian rebels, both of which angered the British and French respectively. If you want to see a great visual on the Algerian independence movement, I recommend the film The Battle of Algiers from 1966, well, 1967 in the US. Britain and France allied with Israel, while the Soviets and the US actually teamed up on the side of Egypt, as President Eisenhower did not want to escalate into a confrontation with the USSR. In 1957, when the region was no longer occupied by Israel, Nasser was then seen as a pan-Arab hero. The lesson here is that both the Nakba and the Suez Crisis, the Arab states were contested against Israel due to Palestinian resistance, despite none of them seeking war. It was in this era when most founding leaders of the PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, the nationalistic Fatah faction, meaning conquest or victory, within it, and Hamas from the Muslim Brotherhood would take form. But before we move past the Nakba, let's quickly turn to Gowans' work on division specifically. Three main overarching movements formed out of this, looking at the Middle East specifically: Arabism, Islamism, and Communism. While Arabism and Communism were rather distasteful of each other, both sat politically on the left, while Islamism was the right-wing reactionary movement. It's for this reason that the US often recruited Islamists to fight Arabists in the region. Gowans states, quote, "Pan-Arabism is an unlikely but enormously dangerous threat, not only to US control of the Middle East's lucrative and strategically important oil reserves, but to Western power on a global scale. The Arabs constitute the second largest pan-ethnic group or nation in the world. Only the Han Chinese are more populous. A single Arab nation-state, if one would be formed, would cover a vast majority stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf and would comprise 400 million people." End quote. But it wasn't always as cut and dry. At times, the US would also employ Arabists to fight communists in the region, such as recruiting Saddam Hussein to execute Communist Party members in Iraq. Hell, this wasn't even just limited to Arab regions, as in the 80s, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan was recruited to fight communists, which led to the rise of the Taliban. The point is, this is how great powers would stoke conflict in the Middle East, sometimes even just by sponsoring religious or ethnic minorities, like the Kurds in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. France actually created Lebanon out of Greater Syria, which was full of Maronite Christians that could rule over the Muslim majority. In a way, the Jews simply became another group to sponsor this division, and as Gowans states, Israel would follow the lines, quote, "providing support for Hamas, an organization originating in the Muslim Brotherhood," end quote, which was also itself used by the US to fight Nasserists in Egypt. So the next time you hear someone reductively dumb down Middle Eastern conflict for this, those people have just been trying to kill each other forever. They're a bunch of terrorists. We can now be reminded that it wasn't so cut and dry and amped up significantly in the time of the Cold War. Part 4. Nasserism, Nazca, and the 6 Days War. What Khalidi describes as the third declaration of war came in 1967 in what was known as the 6 Days War, and to kick that off, we're going to first turn to Gowans as his look at Nasserism plays into this. You see, Nasser was part of a generation that loathed the British presence in Egypt, and under something known as the, quote, Free Officers Movement, the July 23rd Revolution managed to overthrow the British-backed monarchy. This followed with a 6-point program, which were as follows: to end colonialism and the traitors who supported it, to abolish feudalism, to end plutocracy, to create social equality, to build a powerful military, and to harbor a democratic atmosphere. To just about anybody, these aren't bad goals, and Nasser initially wanted to buy arms from the US, but they refused to sell them when he didn't sign to the anti-communist crusade. So he ended up seeking support from the USSR, and this would ultimately make him another boogeyman to the US, leading to the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Now why did this matter? Simple. It made him a threat to US capital, meanwhile many of the Third World sang praise, and he'd go on to inspire other Arab nationalists, for better or worse. Now this is precisely where it becomes relevant, especially in relation to Israel. Despite Ba'ath socialism's distinguished traits that set it apart from communism, it was still concerned with class struggle, women's liberation, and breaks from imperialism. Gowans states that Nasser, quote, secularized the religious court, made education compulsory and free at the primary level, and began the process of ending institutional misogyny, end quote. Which he cites from Nasser, the Last Arab, by Said Abu-Rush. Thus, here's where we see the Muslim Brotherhood, where Hamas was born out of, become a natural ally to the West. The bigger picture is that this is all it would take for Israel to cook up a, quote, threat to the small Jewish state in the Sea of Arab states to justify a lightning attack on the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. According to Gowans, Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, stated, quote, I don't think Nasser wanted war. We must be honest with ourselves, we decided to attack him, end quote. In fact, Nasser only set out 2 divisions to Sinai. They never could have withstood a war against Israel, considering by then Israel was nuclear, and Egypt's forces were tied up in Yemen. In a sense, Israel basically set up a trap with threats to invade Syria and mounted offenses to topple the Arab nationalist government in Iraq. Meanwhile, the Jordanians and Saudi kingdoms were receiving CIA instruction. Turning back to Khalidi, it seems that even that Robert McNamara, then Secretary of State in the US, concluded that no attack on Israel was imminent from Egypt, especially because President Lyndon B. Johnson was aware of Israel's abilities at the time. Johnson's administration also saw a stronger alliance to Israel as he had a, quote, long-standing sympathy for Israel. As Senate Majority Leader in 1956, he opposed Eisenhower's pressure on Israel to withdraw from Sinai and the Gaza Strip, end quote. Thus, these seeds were planted earlier. So in only 6 days, hence the name, Israel occupied all of Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, changing the face of the Middle East entirely, based on a myth of Israel's existence being in danger. Nasser lost miserably, but let's look at the impact that had on the Palestinians to stay focused. In 1964, the Arab League would found the PLO, under Egypt's leadership, which would now be the best outlet for Palestinian representation. 1965 saw the birth of the aforementioned Fatah, and with the PFLP, or Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, in 1967. Most of these groups had the sole goal of returning Arab land and homes to Arab people, including Jews who lived there prior to 1917, I might add. But the objective of a single Palestinian state for all citizens came in 1968 when the Fatah overtook the PLO. By the early 1970s, the PLO floated the idea of an Arab state next to a Jewish one after the many blows presented from Security Council 242. It didn't help that they also didn't receive much support for their neighboring Arab states. For many, the Lebanese Civil War didn't start until 1975, but to the Palestinians it came as early as 1973. 3 PLO leaders were assassinated in their homes by Mossad, which is Israel's national intelligence agency. There were also attempts on the life of the PL leader Arafat Yasser based on classified intelligence. Non-military targets began falling within the scope, and the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon became frequent targets following a confrontation with the Lebanese army thanks to Mossad assassinations. The largest number of deaths came in what was known as the Tel al-Zayter massacre, which killed nearly 2,000 people. By 1977, President Jimmy Carter did call for a Palestinian homeland. However, this was abandoned once Menachem Begin was elected PM in Israel and Anwar Sadat came to power in Egypt. This led to the Camp David process that led to an Egyptian-Israeli treaty in 1979 that saw the return of Sinai to Egypt. While this all sounds good on paper, the price came in the form of an unimpeded colonization of the occupied territories from 1967. The US was now aligned with the most extreme negation of Palestinian rights, as Khalidi states, and this was cemented further while the election of Ronald Reagan took place. Ever since Begin's election, every single successor was completely closed to Palestinian sovereignty, including Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Thus, a dramatic shift in the problem of Israel went forward, known as the Nazca in Arabic, which means setback. Part 5. Lebanon, Intifada, and Resistance. For this next part, we have to hone in on the country of Lebanon, as a lot of the Palestinian question and their struggles took place here. While the Suez Crisis represented a bit of a proxy war that involved false pretenses and an uneven playing ground, 1982 would see what Khalidi calls the fourth declaration of war and the first major one since 1948. This came in the form of Israel invading Lebanon on June 4th due to a presence of the PLO. It saw the flattening of dozens of buildings, as well as a stadium, killing or wounding nearly 50,000 people in Beirut. Meanwhile, only about 360 Israeli soldiers died and a couple thousand were wounded. Now the goal was to end the growing strength that Palestinian nationalism had in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. Further, Prime Minister Begin raked in a Cold War tactic, claiming to President Ronald Reagan that the PLO was a, quote, terrorist group allied with the USSR. Now let's assume for a moment that this is a cold hard fact and there's absolutely no nuance to this statement. Amidst this invasion, 0 of the PLO's functioning command posts were hit, despite the level of accuracy that Israel intelligence could serve at the time. The whole operation lasted a total of 7 weeks, until the USA, Israel, and some allies in Lebanon were able to force the PLO out of the nation. That would see the Lebanese Civil War officially kick off. As you probably presumed, the PLO actually didn't have much support at the time, and in fact, a lot of it was their own doing with rather arrogant behavior. Khalidi states they had, quote, also shot and killed some innocent people in Lebanon, end quote, and further that, quote, there was no punishment or discipline for such inexcusable acts, end quote. Their presence had exposed a lot of innocent people to the presence of Israeli attacks, which caused a lot of discontent in Beirut, understandably so. Things escalated further when the newly elected leader of Lebanon, Bashir Gemayel, was assassinated via bomb blast, which triggered Israel to occupy the western part of the city. The terms for PLO departure were reached on August 12th following Israel's bombardment that was apparently so tough that even Reagan told them to halt. Further, according to Khalidi, they told the US that they would not occupy the city. Why? Well, the US was by this point aware that Israel claimed 2,000 PLO fighters and weaponry did not remain, but massacre still carried on until September 17th of that year. Worst of all, these were carried out at refugee camps, which led to the massacres of women, children, and elderly. This was unfortunately endorsed by Alexander Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State. These massacres were known as the Sabra and Shatila massacre, killing another 1,000 mostly Palestinian and Lebanese Shia, perpetuated by the Lebanese forces backed by the IDF. That's essentially one of Lebanon's Christian militias, and the IDF is Israeli Defense Forces. Remember that thing I mentioned earlier about France creating Lebanon out of Greater Syria? The impact of this war brought about the rise of another group you may have heard of known as Hezbollah. This is also where the Palestinians gathered a significant amount of international sympathy, whilst prior to this they had little backing from the rest of the world. It brought the center of gravity for the movement back to Palestine and out of the surrounding Arab states. A suicide bombing took place in the U.S. Embassy of Beirut, and it would now see Hezbollah as a, quote, deadly foe of the U.S. and Israel, end quote. Again, when Westerners talk of these terrorist groups today, they dismiss it as something that's been around forever. Or they even blame Islam as a whole. Pick your poison. This conveniently ignores all these declarations of war by the colonial forces, which, in case you forgot, is the entire point of this video. But for now, let's move on to what was known as the Intifada 5 years later, or the Fifth Declaration of War, which broke out in December of 1987. The word Intifada translates in the literal sense to shake off, or a more figurative sense, uprising. This refers to a spontaneous uprising in all of the occupied territories, which came after an Israeli army vehicle struck a truck in Jabalia refugee camp, killing 4 Palestinians. This uprising proved to be very difficult to suppress, as it involved coordinated leadership while driven and controlled locally. It included everyone from farmers to business people, students to shopkeepers, poor to professional, and women played a large role as well. Demonstrations were carried out, as well as strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, which often turned violent. By now, much of the PLO was operating out of Tunis in Tunisia, but due to Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon launching invasions in 1982, they had created quite a problem for themselves within Palestine. It may also have to do with the repression tactics even used in the 1970s. Khalidi states, quote, by 1976, any expression of nationalism, meaning flying the Palestinian flag, displaying the Palestinian colors, organizing trade unions, voicing support for the PLO, or any resistance organization, was severely repressed with fines, beatings, and jail, end quote. But by now, former Prime Minister and statesman Yitzhak Rabin upped the ante, ordering the breaking of arms and legs and smashing of protesters' skulls at the soldiers' discretion. This is actually where the iconic image of the boy throwing a rock at a tank that I have up on the screen came from. Now, propaganda would come to play a large role at this point. Young Palestinians knew no life outside of occupation by the late 80s, but Israel would be using the disproportionate response under the guise of, quote, a small country being overwhelmed by Arab states, end quote. Gee, you have to wonder why that is. Unfortunately for them, the Intifada mobilized Palestinians more and shaped world perspective, as the uprising produced, quote, gripping scenes of street battles between young Palestinian protesters and Israeli troops, end quote. Further, television viewers were riveted by, quote, repeated tableaus of wrenching violence, which inverted the image of Israel as a perpetual victim, casting it as Goliath against the Palestinian David, end quote. Meanwhile, in Tunis, the PLO wasn't particularly able to grasp the nature of the occupation regime. In many ways, they actually hurt the resistance movement due to the inability to also understand the role and measure of the United States' backing, and proceeded to dominate the resistance movement. Arafat had allowed them to be drawn into a process designed by Israel, leading the PLO recognizing Israel as a state on December 14th in order to open dialogue with the US. These talks would begin in Madrid in 1991 on another completely uneven playing ground. For one, the 1978 Camp David Accords were referenced to give Palestinians self-rule, but this didn't give them any control of their land and resources. With the disappearance of the USSR, the US was now the sole mediator, and, making matters worse, the PLO hurt itself by supporting Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Arafat's claim was that Kuwait was born out of colonial boundaries, but the fact is, so was all of the Middle East. He also gravely overestimated Iraq, relying too much on them as their safeguard of Palestinians and their borders. The result of all this was the creation of the Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority in 1992 to give them authority in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. However, the Zionist doctrine wouldn't allow for this, and Israel kept control of the land, water, security, airspace, and even movement. Rabin, now Prime Minister again, would be the first to recognize the Palestinian people and the PLO as representative in exchange for Israeli recognition by the PLO. This secret exchange became known in 1993 as the Oslo I Accord. Yasser Arafat returned to Palestine in 1994, and the PLO moved to top positions from Tunis into the occupied territories. Now that sounds all well and dandy, except the colonial aspect of this did not disappear. What the PLO just did was sign an extremely restrictive form of self-rule. Walls were built up. Access by Arabs to the Orient House and Ramallah were stopped, and many were prevented from living in Jerusalem. Further, restrictions of movement was extremely intense, and seizure accelerated. Palestinians effectively found themselves living in a cage. In other words, Oslo only preserved the framework that was advantage to Israel. Troops heavily policed the Arab-dense population centers, and the US continued holding this up with muscle in the form of loads of money, tax-free loans, military, arms, and legal support. Part 6. Oslo Conference, the Second Intifada, and Hamas. The final part that we'll look at before concluding the problem with Israel will be everything that came after the Oslo Conference and the conditions of the colonial project that leads right up to what we've been seeing in the news in the past couple years. Right about here is where a lot of the focus lies in the Gaza Strip, as it was circled entirely by Israeli troops on the land and their navy in the sea. Fortified checkpoints make it very difficult to enter and leave, closures interrupt the import of goods, and economic life begins going under strangulation. Sounds awfully familiar. Free movement between Gaza and Jerusalem, or the West Bank, worsens this, and Palestinians are now required to obtain permits. I believe this is a good time to talk further about Hamas. I spoke earlier about its origins in the Muslim Brotherhood and how it was originally funded by Israel in the era of Nasser. But it grew far quicker after the events of 1987, wanting its own identity as a militant Islamist group that denounced diplomacy after Oslo. This group claimed that the entirety of Palestine, not just the occupied areas after 1967, as it felt that the PLO was too accommodating of Israel. Thus, in September of 2000, what was known as the Second Intifada took place, creating an uptick in violence and an escalated rivalry between Hamas and the PLO. Wow, you mean to tell me that you can be pro-Palestine and anti-Israel while not supporting Hamas? I never would have guessed that such a thing could exist. The reaction on Israel's part to this was, of course, to use live ammunition on any demonstrator, which then led the PA, or Palestinian Authority, to take up arms. Worse, Hamas resorted to suicide bombings. Bad move, as that definitely hurt international support that the Palestinians had finally gained. In November of 2004, Yasser Arafat died, and he was replaced by Mahmoud Abbas as elected president of the Palestinian Authority. Starting in January 2005, this was to be a 4-year term. However, he continued in power afterwards despite not having popular support, as he was not as charismatic or eloquent as Arafat. Not long after, Hamas would run a slate of candidates in the Palestinian Authority parliamentary elections in 2006, winning a 74 majority seat to the Fatah's 45. With an even greater split now, the PA was unable to form a coalition and was then rejected by both the US and Israel, as neither would acknowledge Hamas as any part of the government. In fact, due to George Bush's Patriot Act in 2001, any material support for Palestine was seen as criminal, especially when Hamas set up its own Palestinian Authority in Gaza, breaking from the Ramallah-based PA in the West Bank where Israel did allow it to function. What was the result of all this? You guessed it, more war. Israel ground offenses would hit Gaza 3 times in 2008, 2012, and 2014 that were accompanied by regular military incursions into their other occupied territories. Those included arrests, assassinations, suppression, demolition of homes, and all these wonderful things you're probably tired of hearing me say by now. Effectively, Israel implemented a full-on siege of Gaza that made it an open-air prison, seeing 53% of its population in complete poverty by 2018. These 3 attacks created a roughly 43-to-1 scale of casualties, and almost all of the Palestinians were civilians, not Hamas. Conversely, almost every Israeli was a soldier. Despite all this, in the newer age of social media and instant technology, the US media would focus coverage only on Hamas, which we still see today. Continued is a disproportionate ground they stand on. Of the nearly 4,000 rockets launched by Hamas, about 5 Israeli lives were lost. Meanwhile, one of the most powerful armies in the world attacked an area of 140 square miles that was heavily populated and had no way for the population to escape. The US supplied drones and Apache helicopters. The American F-15 and 16 bombers, all of which were meant for open battlefields and not heavily populated cities. Much of Gaza City's buildings were leveled. In 2014, around 13,000 people were killed or mangled, keeping with the Israeli military doctrine. What's known as the Da'iya Doctrine got its name from the southern suburb of Beirut, which was destroyed by Israel's Air Force. Israeli Chief of Staff General Gadi Eisenkot stated, "What happened in the Da'iya quarter will happen in every village from which Israel is fired upon. We will apply disproportionate forces on it, cause great damage and destruction from there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages. They are military bases. This is not a recommendation, this is a plan, and it has been approved." This comes right from the mouth of the beast in 2008 from the headline, "Israel warns Hezbollah war would invite destruction." None of this shift in US opinion changed its policies towards Israel. Republicans controlled the White House for 2/3 of the years between 2000 and 2020, controlled the Senate between 2010 and 2020, the House between 2014 and 2018, and every branch between 2016 and 2018. Now, it's been well established that a Democratic regime doesn't see any difference in opinion towards Israel's colonial project, but it still makes a difference when much of the cabinets are full of old, white, conservative evangelicals, which tend to support the most hawkish approaches when it comes to Israel. This matched the ethos of the now Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing branch. Democrats, on the other hand, are a little more contradictory in this realm. Since at the time it had younger and more minority segments within, there was at least some push towards the Palestinian cause, but it's important to note that this doesn't reflect the Democratic Party's elected officials. They're still just as influenced by big donors and associations with the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. Plus, let's not forget the influence of Nancy Pelosi, Charles Schumer, and both Clintons, all of whom are extremely rich with interests aligned with Israel's and the Democratic parties. So in short, every president from Truman to Trump rarely objected to Israeli support. Even exceptions like the Suez Crisis in 1956 still served Israel in the long term. The US never supported advancements of democracy in the Middle East, preferring the monarchies and dictatorships that were vital to US clients in oil, defense, and banking real estate. Conclusion. Like I said at the top, the problem with Israel is that it's a colonial project, existing as an imperialist outpost with nearly a century of war in the name of that colony, all masked as a historical claim to a so-called homeland, backed by the historical mistreatment of Jews in Europe. 100 years after the Balfour Declaration, Donald Trump would recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital only, disposing of the entirety of Palestinians' thousands of years of history. Trump would say, quote, "We took Jerusalem off the table, so we don't have to talk about it anymore. You won 1 point, and you'll give up some points later on the negotiation if it ever takes place. I don't know that it will ever take place." End quote, to Benjamin Netanyahu. The United States, together with the United Kingdom, extended full backing to Israel and the Zionist movement to impose a colonial reality on Palestine in a post-colonial age. To quote Iqbal Ahmed, a Pakistani writer, quote, "August 1947 marked the beginning of decolonization, when British rule in India had ended. It was in those days of hope and fulfillment that the colonization of Palestine occurred. Thus, at the dawn of decolonization, we will return to the earliest, most intense form of colonial menace, exclusivist settler colonialism." End quote. As Khalidi himself states, quote, "With the establishment of Israel, Zionism did succeed in fashioning a potent national movement and a thriving new people in Palestine. but it could not fully supplant the country's original population, which is what would have been necessary for the ultimate triumph of Zionism. Settler colonial confrontations with indigenous peoples have only ended in one of three ways. One, with the elimination or full subjugation of the native population, as in North America. Two, with the defeat and expulsion of the colonizer, as in Algeria, which is extremely rare. Or three, the abandonment of colonial supremacy in the context of compromise and reconciliation, as in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Ireland." End quote. It's also advantageous to Israel that the colonial nature is not very visible to most Americans and Europeans. You see, to us whites here in the West, Israel appears as a, quote, normal nation surrounded by irrational hostility of anti-Semitic Muslims. But if you've made it this far, hopefully by now you can grasp why things are the way they are in the Middle East. Something that helps with the understanding of Palestine to Westerners is the comparison of them to other colonial subjects like the Native Americans, South Africans, or Irish. Focusing on the gross imbalance of power, which was similar in those examples, really highlights the crux of the matter. Issues of inequality are very easy to understand, but on the contrary, the biblical dimension of Zionism is what tends to hurt Palestinian understanding, which I touched on at the beginning. It casts these new arrivals as indigenous proprietors of the land that they colonized. Further, the post-Holocaust world boosted the resurgence of a Jewish nation-state, attempting to compare it to the kingdom of David and Solomon, despite thousands of years of history seeing the Jewish majority now mix into European states. I mean, really, why else would there be this seemingly white outpost in the middle of the Arab world? Challenging this in the US becomes extra difficult with its long steeple in evangelical Protestantism. It also doesn't help that the word colonial in the US is different from the association in former European imperial metropolises. Settler and pioneer are usually taught with a positive connotation in US schools, and the pushback against this in more enlightened age is why old white men think there's a woke problem in schools. Finally, if that isn't enough, there's a false constant depiction of two sides with equal footing, as people in the West tend to not be able to think in gray spaces. Everything is either black and white, good or bad, one against the other. But what's the solution here? Really, it will come down to the uprooting of systemic inequality of Zionism to create a better future for Jews and Palestinians. I know, some of you may be thinking, what, the solution isn't to expel the Israeli population? To which I say, of course not. Just like the solution to the Jewish question in Europe was to make Jews safe everywhere, the same solution is going to apply to Palestine. How do you think Australia, Canada, and the US populations would react to being ousted from a land they've gotten undeniable national identity from, with the history they played no hand in? Let's look at Khalidi's quote on this one last time. He states, quote, "Most Palestinians are descended from people who have lived in what they naturally see as their country for a very long time, for many centuries if not many millennia. Most Israeli Jews came from Europe and the Arab countries relatively recently as part of a colonial process sanctioned and brokered by great powers. The former are indigenous, the latter are settlers or descendants of settlers. Although many have been there for generations now, and have a deeply felt and ancient religious connection to the country, albeit one quite different from the ancient rootedness in the country of the indigenous Palestinians. Because this is a colonial conflict, this difference matters enormously. No one today would deny that fully developed national entities exist in settler states like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, despite their origins in colonial wars of extermination. Moreover, to those intoxicated by nationalism, such distinctions between settlers and indigenous peoples do not matter. As the anthropologist Ernest Gellner put it, nations as a natural, God-given way of classifying men as an inherent political destiny are a myth. Nationalism sometimes takes pre-existing cultures and turns that into nations, sometimes inventing them and often obliterates pre-existing cultures. That is reality. While the fundamentally colonial nature of the Palestinian-Israeli encounter must be acknowledged, there are now two peoples in Palestine, irrespective of how they came into being, and the conflict between them cannot be resolved as long as the national existence of each is denied by the other. Their mutual acceptance can only be based on complete equality of rights, including national rights, notwithstanding the crucial historical differences between the two. There is no possible sustainable solution, barring the unthinkable notion of one people's extermination or expulsion by the other. Overcoming the resistance of those who benefit from the status quo in order to ensure equal rights for all in this small country between the Jordan River and the sea, this is a test of the political ingenuity of all concerned. Reducing the existence sustained external support for the discriminatory and deeply unequal status quo would certainly smooth the path ahead." End quote. But that's the crazy part about all of this. Since the Balfour Declaration, it has been nothing but the Israeli nation expanding into the Palestinian one, crushing it, obliterating it, and carrying out full-on genocide from an Israeli nationalistic side. So it's no wonder that terrorist organizations take form from the receiving end of the barrel, going against world superpowers and paying the price of Hitler's crimes, as stated earlier. The solution is an extermination of the now generations of Israeli Europeans in Palestine, but rather the end of the genocide, suppression, and complete disregard of Palestinian from the Israeli. But how that gets carried out is completely a different question. Unfortunately, we are also not seeing a lot of progress where this is concerned, and that's why what we've seen since October 7th of 2023 has been made even worse. In a way, I could almost call this a seventh declaration of war, a new era following the events of Khalidi's book. Folks like to pretend that this was when everything started, that the Palestinians are a random terrorist group coming seemingly out of nowhere, making your conservative uncle at holiday gatherings wonder why a bunch of, quote, woke libs or some other nonsense care about this cause. Now you know. Joe Biden's administration did not shy away from rampant support of Israel in its operation and genocide. Donald Trump's so-called, quote, deal of the century aimed to close off decades of U.S. policy and strategy with Israel. The Trump administration pushed to give Israel complete control of the occupied territories and declared Palestinians no longer refugees. It completely outsources the U.S. foreign policy to Netanyahu, abandoning even the smallest lick of impartiality in the conflict. This is at odds with every principle of the so-called freedom and democracy that the U.S. claims to stand for, and it will be met with resistance. If that alone isn't enough, then perhaps look to its backing of Israel brought together with the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain, three repressive Islamic regimes against Iran, another Islamic repressive regime that happens to go against Washington. Perhaps I'll soon make a similar video on that. If you made it to the very end of this super long video, I want to thank you so much. This was quite different from most of the Nick Geo content up to this point. I tend to cover travel and geographical topics at random that interest me, and this is the first time I ever attempted a political narrative. So I'd love to see some feedback and if you'd like to see more of this type of thing. For a while I shied away from politics as the algorithm seems to hate anything that doesn't support the absolute status quo, but since the algorithm hasn't been nice to me anyway, I figured why not just talk about whatever I want. The topic of Palestine is one that I've studied and cared about for years now, so it was nice to throw all this together in one coherent space. I'd love to tackle more subjects like this, although there's going to be no real schedule, and that might get harder as the political climate in the US gets even worse, and topics of countries people know nothing about get thrown around even more ambiguously. So stay tuned, and again, thank you so much. Cheers.